Welcome to the book of Colossians, a short little letter addressing a specific problem. But before we get into that specific problem, let's recall for a minute our discussion on the prison epistles. There are 4 of them. 3 of them are all tied together. And if you study the closing greetings of Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon, you would discover that Paul wrote those 3 letters from prison at the same time and sent them by the same letter carrier, a guy named Tychicus. Let's take a look for a minute at the travels of Tychicus. So Paul wrote Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon from prison and gave them to Tychicus. Tychicus jumped on a boat, sailed across the Aegean, landed here in Ephesus, where he dropped off his first letter, and then went down the road to Colossae. Let's look at another picture here of this inland strip of Asia. Tychicus traveled from Ephesus to Colossae, where he dropped off the letter, and Paul instructs Tychicus to have this letter read to the church in Laodicea as well. Now, these 3 cities are called the 3 sister cities. Curious fact, the 2 longest closing greetings in Paul's letters are to churches that he had never visited, Rome and Colossae. You see, Paul, he never visited Colossae, and he certainly didn't plant the church in this city. It was planted by a guy named Epaphras. Let me show you that. Jump over to the text here. It says in chapter 2, verse 1, that he has a great struggle for this church and for those in Laodicea. There's Laodicea again. And for all who have not seen me face to face. Paul had never seen members of this church face to face. It was actually Epaphras, we see in verse 7 of chapter 1, that they learned the gospel from Epaphras. Epaphras started the church in Colossae. Well, let's get back to that specific problem now that we've laid that groundwork a bit. So Epaphras is going to visit Paul in Rome, in prison, and he's going to say, man, Paul, I need your help. My church is doing pretty well, but there are a few members in the church who have contracted FOMO. They have a fear of missing out on the full Christian experience. You see, there are some new members of my church who've joined recently. There's some Jewish Christians, and they're telling people in my church that if they want to be truly pleasing to God, they have to obey the Torah like they do. And there's this other group that have joined the church as well. I guess I may call them mystics. They're saying that if you want to be truly spiritual, well, you have to practice Christianity the way that I practice it. Well, Paul is not going to allude to this problem that Epaphras describes to him. He's not going to allude to that problem until chapter 2, verse 4 of this letter, and that's where I want to start. In chapter 2, Paul is going to refute this heresy. We're going to call it the Colossian heresy. And in the next lecture, I want to take a look at how he sets the stage in chapter 1 for this refutation in chapter 2, and then how he provides the alternative in chapter 3. Don't do this instead. But we'll get to that in our next lecture. So let's jump into chapter 2, verse 4, where it all begins. All right, let me scroll down to chapter 2. It says, I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments. Now, who is this individual, and what are his plausible arguments, which it looks like are taking some of the Colossians captive? Well, notice in verse 8 of chapter 2, this little expression, according to. These arguments evidently are according to human tradition and according to the elemental spirits of the world, and both of these 2 things are set in contrast to Christ. They're according to human tradition, they're according to the elemental spirits, but they're not according to Christ. And it's possible that these two different things, human tradition, elemental spirits, that they're talking about the same thing. But I think that the Colossians are being pulled away from Christ in two separate directions. Towards human tradition and towards elemental spirits. And the human tradition, I think, is Jewish tradition, where these Jewish Christians are telling the Colossians that, worship Messiah, but follow the Torah like we do as well. You see, Christ is not enough. You need Christ and law of Moses. Let me show you in chapter 2, verse 16. That one half of the Colossian heresy. So scroll down to verse 16. It says, "Let no one pass judgment on you." These Jewish Christians are passing judgment on the Colossians. Why? Because the Colossians, they are not following the food laws, it looks like, of the Mosaic law. Don't let them pass judgment on you in regards of food or drink, or festival, new moon, or Sabbath. Now, Sabbath, that's clearly referring to Jewish law. But you see this whole packet, festival, new moon, or Sabbath, this is a standard expression or a standard list used to describe Jewish holy days. Take a look at Ezekiel 45:17, where all of these offerings are to be prepared for feasts, new moons, Sabbaths. There we go, 3 things. Same thing in Hosea 2:11, where it says, "I will put an end to all of her feasts, new moons, Sabbaths." So clearly we're talking about observance of the law here, and the Jews are judging them for not observing the Torah. And it seems also that circumcision is probably being advocated by them as well, just because of how Paul responds to this element of the Colossian heresy. All right, so these Jewish Christians are judging the Colossians. The mystics, as I'm calling them, they are attempting to disqualify them, saying, if you don't do X, Y, and Z like we do, well, then you are disqualified from the true, full Christian experience. So what do they insist on? It says asceticism and the worship of angels. What's that about? Let's get back to Colossians 2. Look at this other half of the Colossian heresy. Back to Colossians 2. So there are the Jews who insist on Torah observance, and there are the mystics who disqualify the Colossians, insisting on asceticism, worship of angels, and going on in detail about visions. Well, what is going on there? Asceticism, this one's pretty easy to understand. Asceticism is kind of like a severe self-denial of bodily comforts, physical bodily comforts, supposedly for a spiritual end or a spiritual goal. And it seems possible that maybe these Colossian heretics, these mystics, are saying that when we are severe to our body in this way, it gives us spiritual experiences, visions, Paul says in verse 18 there. But what about this worship of angels? Now, that's a strange one. It's probably not referring to the Colossians worshiping the angels themselves, because that's just way too blatantly unorthodox. These people would never be accepted in the church if they were advocating that. It seems more likely that what they're talking about is not men worshiping angels, but angels worshiping something else, probably good angels worshiping God. You know, it's like the worship of the church is the church worshiping God. The worship of angels is angels worshiping God, and it's possible that they supposed that their ascetic practices would get them into this frenzied spiritual state in which they would be transported, like Isaiah, to the throne room of God, where they would be behold the angels worshiping God, saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." And all that sounds good, right? But Paul is going to say that those who insist on these spiritual disciplines and experiences are puffed up without reason by their sensuous minds. So this is no good. How then is Paul going to respond to these kind of two halves of the Colossian heresy? Well, to the Jewish half, I guess, in verse 17, it's critical. He's going to say that that the Torah, following the laws of the Torah, it was simply a shadow of the good things to come, and the substance of which is in Christ. Let's look at that. It's such a critical verse. Here we go. All the Torah, they were simply a shadow of the things to come. The substance is in Jesus. It belongs to Jesus. So shadow versus substance. I don't know. Can you see my shadow on the whiteboard here? Maybe you can't. But the shadow resembles the reality, but it falls so short of that reality. So the old covenant priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood, it resembled, but was only a shadow of the true great high priest, Jesus himself. The old covenant animal sacrifices, they were a shadow of the once and for all sacrifice of Jesus. The Torah, which was written on stone, is merely a shadow of the new covenant promise that God would write his law not on stone, but on our hearts. And I think that that's the line of reasoning that Paul is considering when he addresses circumcision here. And he is going to say that you, Colossians, even though you're Gentiles and you haven't been physically circumcised, you have been circumcised without hands. What he's talking about is not physical circumcision, but a circumcision of the heart. This is Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. He's talking about being born again, indwelt with the Spirit, passing from the old creation to the new creation. And he's going to insist that this circumcision of the heart, being born again, this is a work of God that comes to you from grace, not from observance of the law, because you are circumcised in Messiah. Your heart is circumcised in Messiah with union to him. Let me show you that in chapter 2. Verse 11. So we're still responding to the Jewish half of the Colossian heresy here. And look in verse 11. It says, in him. I have highlighted in pink here all of these union with Christ statements. Very important in Colossians. In him, in Messiah, you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands. Referring to the passing away of the old creation, it died because you were buried with him in baptism. You died with Jesus, your old self, and the new self, the new creation, was raised with Jesus in his resurrection. Awesome, right? So how does Paul then respond to the mystics? Well, he's going to continue this idea of union with Christ and having died with Christ. And in that death, it says that you died to the elemental spirits. So what are these elemental spirits? Well, if you look at the context, it seems like we're referring to spiritual beings, probably fallen angels in this context. I have it in purple. So these elemental spirits of the world, the elemental spirits are most likely talking about the rulers and authorities, powers and dominions. Paul will go on about in length in Ephesians chapter 6. So the Colossians, their former lives in paganism, before they heard the gospel and became believers, their former lives were dominated by these elemental spirits, all of the Roman gods, the pagan gods that they worshipped, and real demons kind of took the place of these Roman gods, and they were enslaved to them. And they had to placate these gods, these elemental spirits, with practices like asceticism and what Paul calls severity to the body. That makes me think of the competition, Elijah's competition with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And you remember what those prophets of Baal attempted to do, or what they did, attempting to get Baal to listen to them? They would beat their body and slash their flesh, bleeding, blood gushing from their body. And of course, Baal didn't listen to them. But that's this severity of the body, and perhaps that's going a little bit farther than maybe what these Colossian heretics would have recommended. But regardless, Paul is saying that is not how you worship Jesus. And there is no spiritual being, there is no intermediary between you and Jesus. Because Jesus, man, he is the king. Jesus is the king over all spiritual forces. Let me show you where he makes that point in chapter 2. Again, we're following the trail of purple here, not the yellow brick road, the purple brick road. So Jesus, in him, Jesus is the head of all rule and authority. He is the king over them, and he became king. He was exalted to the position of king. Philippians 2 tells us, when he humbled himself to the point of death on a cross. And that death, it says, it disarmed the rulers and authority. It disarmed them. It put them to shame. And Christ triumphed over them in the cross. Therefore, man, whatever authority that these elemental spirits once had over you, Colossians, because of your sin and your slavery to sin, that authority, their authority, it is crushed, nailed to the cross. Therefore, do not submit, Paul says, to regulations. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. For you do not worship Christ in that way. So if we take a step back, both of these elements, they have an appearance of wisdom, don't they? In that they kind of depict a self-made religion, a religion that you can accomplish by your own works and of your own power. But self-made religion, the problem with it is that it lacks power, Paul says. Look at this. Let's see, 23. This is such an important explanation from Paul. All of these things, these elements of the Colossian heresy, they have an appearance of wisdom. They promote self-made religion, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. They can't make you more Christ-like. They can't change your character. They don't have that power. They're just rules. What does have that power? What can change you? Up in 19, holding fast to the head, holding fast to Jesus. In so doing, the whole body is nourished, and it grows with the growth that comes from God. Now, secondly, both of these elements, they promise fullness, don't they? You want the full Christian experience, follow the law. You want the full Christian experience, do these ascetic practices in order to get these visions or whatnot. That they promise fullness, but Paul says no, they are not fullness, they are empty. He calls them empty deceit. True fullness is found, of course, in Messiah Jesus. Let's look at this. Probably the most important verses in the whole book of Colossians. Let's scroll up. So this philosophy that's according to human tradition and according to the elemental spirits of the world, it is an empty philosophy. But in Jesus, the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. All of the glory and the majesty and the omnipotence of God himself, it is in the body of Jesus Christ, because Jesus is God. And get this is amazing. This is what the Colossians needed to hear. All the fullness of deity dwells within Messiah Jesus, and you, Colossians, you have been filled in him. Man, all of the fullness of Jesus, because of your union with him, is now inside of you. Therefore, you do not need to supplement your faith with these rules, this self-made religion. All of the fullness of Christ is in you. That's a fact that's worth repeating. So that, my friends, is the Colossian heresy and Paul's response to it here in chapter 2. In our next lecture, I want to show you how Paul sets the stage for this refutation, and then how he gives us the alternative. Don't live in this way. Don't follow these practices. Do this instead. We'll get to that next.